Hey everybody, this is TJR.
And this is Superfan.
If you're new here, welcome to the channel. If not, welcome back. And I wanted to talk about something, a quote from Roger Daltrey of The Who. Back in March, NME Online was interviewing him. They were interviewing him in regards to some charity shows that he was doing for the Teenage Cancer Trust, some shows that he was doing at the Royal Albert Hall. And at the end of the interview, he was asked about the possibility of a new Who album. And I'm going to just read this quote from him here. "What's the point?" Daltrey laughed in response. "What's the point of records? We released an album 4 years ago, 2019's Who. And it did nothing. It's a great album too, but there isn't the interest out there for new music these days. People want to hear the old music. I don't know why, but that's the fact." He also added later during the same interview, record companies, they just don't do the same job as they used to. I can understand his frustration. I can identify with it quite a bit, and I'm sure you can too, just from having been around me.
Yeah, you've done your own releases.
I've done my own releases, but also Robert and I, for years, did a web series on YouTube called Music Worth Buying, where we promoted, we recommended new releases, we reviewed them. Those videos were always the lowest viewed videos that we did when we would do reviews. But we did it for years because we believed in it. The album that Daltrey's talking about, entitled simply Who, was a really good album. Better than we have any right to expect. I have no idea how it sold, but during the time that Robert and I were doing the Music Worth Buying series, we both commented on this growing trend of legacy artists releasing, in some cases, some of the best music of their careers, and it just was ignored by and large. Here's a few quick examples here. This was from 2010, an album by Heart entitled Red Velvet Car. I remember when I reviewed it that I said, this album is as good as anything they did in the 70s. Did it sound like their 70s output? No, because it was a different band by this time. Still Ann and Nancy Wilson, but the band members were different. So yeah, it's gonna have a different sound. But as far as the strength of the material, just as strong, just as good, in my opinion. And yet, this album couldn't get recognized to save its life, This one here from John Mellencamp here, maybe just a few years prior, Life, Death, Love and Freedom. I would say the material on this album was stronger than anything he did back when he was getting MTV and radio airplay all the time, which would have been in the 80s. That's kind of where he came up, late 70s, early 80s. And again, couldn't get arrested with it. Robert and I always just thought that was just so, we were frustrated by it for the artists.
Absolutely, yeah. There's so many albums that have come out since in the new millennium, say, in the past 20 years, 20 plus years, that's scary to think about, that have not gotten any recognition at all and are as good or better than, major hit albums.
Well, yeah, not just by legacy artists, but by just simply new artists.
Yeah. Whose
music just gets ignored. Now, I could probably talk all day about why this is, but in regards to the legacy artists, like The Who or Heart or Mellencamp, especially an artist like The Who basically, they came out at a time when FM rock was this new thing, and it broke lots of artists, and radio, of course, was regional versus national. And it was easier to break an artist at that point into radio. And radio was how these artists got introduced to my generation, which was the boomer generation.
Yeah.
Artists like The Who, they were introduced to a generation where the music found them. All the legendary artists that I will talk about on this channel from time to time, like Led Zeppelin, the Beatles, The Who, all these artists were discovered by a record label, by their A&R staffs. They were promoted by them. And here in the United States, they were aggressively promoted to radio. And it was easier to break them in because radio was regional. You'd get them in a regional market first, a smaller market, and you'd build. And if the music caught on, other radio stations would start picking up on it until it became nationwide. And this led to record sales. But the generation I grew up, the boomers, music found us because we would listen to the radio. We didn't have streaming, we didn't have, there was no MTV. The music found us by turning on the radio and we'd hear it, oh, that's good, I like that, Repeat plays, of course, were key to where you would begin to say, hey, I like this, because I don't think most people realize if a song is necessarily good on the first listen. Sometimes if it's exceptional, but I think it always takes at least 3 plays before you start to really, oh yeah, this is good. You lock into it. So it was a totally different world at that point. By the time we get into the new millennium, by that time, regional radio doesn't really exist anymore.
No, it's all corporate.
And it began, I would say, probably in the late 70s, early 80s, I'm guessing, when more regional stations started getting bought up by major media companies. And so they program everything across the board. And speaking of the United States, I can't speak about the rest of the world, but I'm guessing it's probably a lot the same. Also, of course, rock is not a dominant radio format anymore, except in the realm of classic rock. The main formats nowadays are contemporary pop. Well, the biggest one is country. Country music, urban contemporary, and modern pop. And as far as rock, all there is classic rock. I once, during the 80s, I studied broadcasting and I interned at a major market FM rock radio station, KLOS, that is still here in Los Angeles. They are a classic rock station now, but they were once a FM rock station. And by the time I was working there, they were already experiencing this whole thing where they're being, where these stations are being bought by major companies. And at that time, even then in the 80s, their policy was, this was not something they advertised to the public, but this was their internal policy. We don't play a new track until 2 other major stations are playing it first. It had to be proven first by 2 other major stations before they would play it. That's how safe they played the game. And you just began to have this escalation of radio stations that just weren't open to new stuff. And if they were, it had to sound a lot like what they have already been playing. This, of course, what this does is it just creates...
Homogenizes.
It homogenizes everything. Yes, that's the word. It creates a certain amount of homogeneity where everything starts to sound the same. And I hear this from people they say this all the time. Yeah, all the hit songs, they all sound the same. And this is deliberate because they're afraid you'll tune away if you hear something that's a little too different.
Yeah. Make your song sound like this.
Exactly, yeah. Try to make your song sound like everything else that's on the radio.
Or make your song sound like your last biggest hit.
Your last biggest hit. Because what can record labels do but encourage that or only promote that because that's the only way they can get on the radio. It has to sound like everything else that's already out there. So they have to encourage that to be able to get something on the radio. And so I don't really blame record labels so much as I just blame radio as it morphed throughout the 90s and the new millennium as it morphed. And then I'm just talking about pop, country and all of that. As far as rock's concerned, rock stations, FM rock, the kind that, broke artists like The Who, Led Zeppelin and all of them, they became classic rock stations eventually. And the thing about classic rock stations, and I did a whole video about them, but basically they're only interested in playing the pre-established hits that built these stations. The new stuff they're not going to touch. And there was no place for artists like Hart or Mellencamp or even The Who for their new music to be heard on radio, which, and again, I'm talking the boomers, my generation, a lot of them still just listen to radio. Now, on this channel, I know we have a lot of viewers who are more adventurous. You know,
they're actively.
A lot of them are actively listening, but even still, a lot of them are, and I know this from the comment section. A lot of them are still only interested in the old stuff that they grew up with. Now, some of this, of course, is because once you pass 30, you get less and less interested in new music. You have less and less time for it. But the other part of it is that the format that we grew up with, which is radio, is not finding new music for us anymore. At least not in rock anyways. And so rock is no longer a major radio format anymore. That's just the way it is right now. Robert and I recently kind of got re-energized about reviewing albums on this channel here, and we launched some episodes of a series called Music is Still Good. We've still got some episodes that I need to put out there, but they ended up being the lowest watched videos on this channel. Now, the people who watch them really appreciate them, and they're really into discovering new music. But again, I know that most of the audience here skews older, and so they're not as interested in new music. But even then, I think for a lot of younger kids, it's just whatever makes the playlists, you know, as far as the streaming services are concerned. And radio, very limited as far as modern pop. But yeah, but I mean, I get where he's coming from. And, you know, The Who, a legacy act. And if he's saying the album didn't do anything, wow. You know, I haven't looked at the numbers, but I have to say, wow, that's just a shame.
Well, yeah, but you have to take into consideration, too, that people listen differently. Mm-hmm. I guarantee you he was looking at purely album sales.
Maybe.
Who knows what it did on streaming?
I've heard other legacy artists say the same thing. You know, like it's so, you know, it costs money to make a new album. There's work involved, and then to release it, and then it doesn't do anything. And I've heard a lot of legacy artists kind of say the same thing, that it just doesn't go anywhere. And even then, it can be hard for them to break into the algorithm because, again, rock is not a dominant format as far as streaming, and they're not going to break into radio. And then again, we go back to that whole idea that radio, the generation that grew up with rock, that's their primary resource. That's how they grew up, with the music finding them. Whereas now you have to find the music if you want to find good rock. Or pop music as we grew up with it versus pop music now, which I think is two very different things. Because we had rock, we had heavy rock, we had jazz rock, we had soft rock, easy listening, you know. Yeah. Pop music was pretty varied.
Yeah.
Not so much now. Pop is, when I listen to modern pop, it's very defined, I think, by a certain production style, by and large. And I'm not saying good new songs don't come out with pop from pop. Once in a while, yeah, they do.
But kids today, and we know this from mentoring, they listen to music differently. And we've talked about this on the channel before. I listened to K-Rock.
When you were growing up, that was your station, And that was very much a very cutting edge station in the 80s that came out of the late 70s, early 80s. And they called themselves Rock of the 80s very quickly once the 80s broke. And they were very cutting edge. They broke a lot of artists. But they were not part of but they were separate from what was the FM rock that I grew up with in the 70s.
But you were more of a KMET, KLOS.
Yeah.
Mainstream rock as opposed to
FM rock.
Well, mainstream.
KMET was cutting edge because their DJs basically played what they formatted their shows, the DJs themselves. K-Rock did the same thing. The DJs picked their songs. Of course, eventually, KMET went away. Yeah. And K-Rock, of course, got bought by a larger media company. And the DJs...
CBS, they're owned by now.
Yeah. The DJs, as time went on, the DJs got to play less and less and less of what they wanted, until I think there was, at one point I remember, where they got to pick one track per hour, and then I'm sure by now that's gone completely.
Yeah.
They don't have to pick anything. And I haven't listened to K-Rock in a long time, but I get the feeling that it is more nostalgia-based now, catering to the generation that grew up with it in the 80s.
Yeah.
When they were teenagers.
Yeah. The same audience. They haven't grown into a new audience.
Yeah. I'm sure that's what they are now. Neither of us listen to any of these stations anymore. I stopped listening to radio ages ago because I knew it wasn't going to introduce me to anything new and exciting anymore.
Yeah, I have my iTunes.
Yeah.
I still use that.
Yeah, we both have our music collections imported into our mobile devices, which we've ripped all our CDs and stuff, and I ripped my vinyl, and we've ripped all that to our mobile devices so we can.
Thousands of albums.
Yeah. We're basically our own radio stations now, and but we still purchase new music, and we still go out there and look for it.
Yeah.
And are interested in hearing what's
new and used.
Yeah. Well, new, or not only new, but new to you, which is older music that you've never heard before. And to this day, there are still tons of albums that I've never heard. There are still artists out there whose catalogs I've not fully explored. But to this day, like, oh, it's time to explore this artist now. And learn and start to explore, even though they go back to the 60s or the 70s. You know, it's where you move beyond the hits, and I still do that. You still do that, where we just explore stuff. But yeah, so I kind of get it with Roger. I mean, it's like I said, Robert and I still want to review new albums. And by the way, it's called Music Is Still Good. I do have a playlist of those videos if you want to watch them and discover new albums, do recommendations from the two of us. We're going to see if we can retool that a little bit. Maybe it'll work out better. I am grateful to hear, though, that even though Roger Daltrey has, kind of like said, what's the point? When Pete Townsend was asked the same thing, not in that interview, by the way, it's just separately, he expressed excitement about the possibility of making another Who album with Roger Daltrey, saying that he's got lots of, ideas for songs that he wants to work on. And I'm glad to hear that, because I know it's not free to record and create music, trust me, I know this. I think if you can, you should, regardless of whether you think it's going to initially break big or not. Because just because you release an album and maybe it doesn't do well at first doesn't mean it's not going to be considered a classic 10 or 20 years later. Doesn't make it any less valid. And so I definitely think you should, put the music out there if you're able to. I'm glad to hear that Pete Townsend is at least excited about it. And the possibility that there might still be something beyond this album. But if this was their last album, hey, it's a good note to land on still, in my opinion. So yeah, anyways, those are our thoughts on this.
Let us know what you think.
Yeah, let us know what you think about it. As always, if you like these videos, hit like, hit subscribe, hit the bell notification icon so you never miss a video. And if you'd like to show some extra support, Patreon supporters do get exclusive weekly videos not available here on this channel.
You are fierce and mighty.
If you can't be a Patreon supporter, we understand. You can always give us a one-time super thanks. And if not, just click like and share these with anyone you think might be interested.
You can give us super thanks more than one time.
Well, yes, you can do it more than once. We won't complain. But if you just do it once, we appreciate it. Everybody, thank you so much for hanging out and watching and listening, and let us know what you think. We really appreciate it. It means a lot that you take time out of your day to just, stop by. We'll see you all in the next video. Take care. Bye.